Welcome to Washington. I'm still reporting on the economy. This is a shot out our north window of our studio. This is the White House, south lawn of the White House, and this is the National Christmas tree. It's Christmas time in Washington. Okay, first of all, I want to thank the 100 of you who submitted positive customer reviews to Amazon.com. It worked. We are now selling The Secret of Oz there once again. Secondly, from the mailbag, Kenneth W. Ayers of Encinitas, California, wrote in after watching The Secret of Oz. Ken is a cousin of Ray Bolger, the man who played the Scarecrow in the 1939 MGM movie The Wizard of Oz. Everyone who watches The Secret of Oz will witness the hopes and dreams of America on display and will want to take actions necessary to restore our freedom. Many thanks, Ken. Next, I've taken some flack for claiming that the interest on the national debt in the coming year would be $700 billion because the government's official estimate is only $383 billion. In fact, I was so concerned about getting it wrong that I took it out of the final cut of The Secret of Oz. I did insert it, however, in the November 8th edition of this report. Well, as it turns out, this week the government suddenly wants to raise the debt ceiling $1.8 trillion.
How will we ever pay back $13–14 trillion in outstanding debt? Remember, every extra trillion that you borrow means an extra $50 billion every year in interest. That's $1 billion per week in interest alone, some of it going to foreigners for years and years and years to come.
So, with a debt limit of $14 trillion times $50 billion equals exactly $700 billion we will be paying per year primarily to the biggest banks. Okay, now for the real news. Despite all the government reassurances that green shoots are visible everywhere, Australia's not so sure. Carl Denninger pointed to a story in Friday's Sydney Morning Herald where opposition finance spokesman Senator Barnaby Joyce said that a default by the U.S. government could trigger an economic Armageddon which will make the recent global financial crisis pale into insignificance. Senator Joyce said that the risk of a U.S. default is remote, but real, and asked the government to be sure in a worst-case scenario that Australia has the capacity to feed ourselves, provide the fundamentals in medicines and basic requirements for our nation. Is it really possible? Are things that bad? Well, investment analyst Nathan Martin points out some very interesting similarities between the Depression of the 1930s and now. Martin pointed out on Friday that after the initial stock market collapse in 1929, the market regained 50% of its lost value, then went into a 2-year slide that destroyed 90% of its value from the high. Initially, the bond market held up, but by late 1930, it too began its death slide, one that would bankrupt thousands of companies and millions of individuals. Martin sees a similar pattern developing today. This week, the Treasury's 30-year bonds begin to drop precipitously, as the stock market has regained about 50% of what it lost last year. But this time, it could be even worse. Our inflation-adjusted per capita debt is over twice what theirs was. Pay attention to the sequence of events that will follow. In Washington last week, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke sounded a threatening tone in the face of increasing support for Representative Ron Paul's bill to audit the Fed. On Friday, Dr. Paul's bill passed the House of Representatives on a vote of 223 to 203 and now moves on to the Senate, where it is expected to be stripped out. Bernanke wrote in the Washington Post, "These measures would threaten the Fed's traditional political independence. Now, what he really means is that Congress has had zero control over the Fed since its creation in 1913. What, those pesky politicians daring to question judgment of us monetary experts? Then Bernanke delivered his not-so-subtle threat to America. These measures would seriously impair the prospects for economic and financial stability in the United States. Whoa! But this type of threat has happened before in American history. Let's turn back the clock now to 1836, the final year of an 8-year pitched battle between the chief money monopolist of his era, Nicholas Biddle, and President Andrew Jackson. Biddle was the president of America's privately owned central bank, then called the Second Bank of the United States. By 1828, opponents of the bank nominated Senator Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, the hero of the final battle of the War of 1812, to run for president. The banks poured millions into Jackson's defeat, but to no avail. The American people were fed up with the privately owned central bank and wanted out. In 1832, with Jackson's re-election approaching, the bank tried to have their charter renewed early in the hopes that Jackson wouldn't want the controversy of a fight with bankers just before the election. They were wrong. Although Congress passed the renewal bill, Jackson vetoed it. His veto message drew a direct line between the bank and its masters in the Bank of England.
It is easy to conceive that great evils to our country and its institutions might flow from such a concentration of power in the hands of a few who are irresponsible to the people.
Nicholas Biddle was head of the Second Bank of the United States. He was brazen with the financial power he wielded over the nation. He even threatened to cause a depression if Jackson's veto were not overturned.
Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress. Our only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm monetary restriction, and I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to restoration of the currency and the recharter of the bank.
Biddle made good on his threat. America was quickly plunged into a deep depression. Property was foreclosed on for pennies on the dollar. Jackson responded forcefully.
You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out.
Eventually, the nation's newspapers sided with Jackson and the bank was not rechartered. Notice the top hat on the image of the banker. Since then, the top hat has always represented the big banker's plutocracy. Jackson then set about paying off the national debt, a debt caused by the government borrowing the nation's money supply into existence. Jackson was the only president who ever paid off the national debt. A few weeks later, an assassin tried to shoot President Jackson. He stuck 2 pistols in the stomach, but both misfired. Jackson solemnly warned the nation about any future attempts to establish another privately owned central bank.
The bold effort the present bank had made to control the government, the distress it had wantonly produced, are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it.
Unfortunately, the American economy is going down with or without Ron Paul's bill. Bernanke knows it. He is just desperately trying to pin the coming tidal wave of blame on someone else, anyone else. Ron Paul's bill can't cause the coming crash, but neither can it prevent it. But shedding light on the Fed is always a good thing, and we all applaud Dr. Paul for his long and arduous fight to get any form of control over the American money supply. My cigar of choice? Craftsman. I'm still reporting on the economy. Good afternoon.